It was the mid-500s AD, and the Pope was in chains. Held captive by the Emperor Justinian in Constantinople, Pope Vigilius reluctantly signed an agreement that, in the eyes of many, betrayed the Council of Chalcedon. This council had declared that Jesus Christ was both fully human and fully divine. Why did this happen? Because the emperor sought unity in his empire, which was splintered because of the council's controversial outcome. Despite protesting the emperor's demands at first, Vigilius caved, and though he signed this agreement under pressure, his action led to the most significant blow to papal authority the Church had yet seen. Rome was humiliated. Its citizens felt betrayed by their weak leader, and it would take centuries for Christian communities across the Western Empire to trust Rome again. We will explore this situation in more detail later this episode, but I wanted to begin with this story to illustrate just how high the stakes were when it came to sniffing out heresy back in those days. A divided Christianity meant a divided Roman Empire, and its rulers were constantly more concerned with maintaining unity for the sake of unity, even if it meant compromising the true Christian faith. Welcome to our History of the Papacy series, in which we examine the rise of papal authority. This material is based on Klaus Schatz's phenomenal book, The Papal Primacy. In 313, Christianity was legalized in the Roman Empire. This gave the papacy a brief bolster in status among other large dioceses, but it did not last long, at least politically, because the Emperor Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to his brand new city, Constantinople. This was in the eastern half of the empire. Up until this point, the most well-respected bishops derived their authority from their apostolicity, meaning they could trace their lineage to the apostles. Constantinople was an outlier, though. There is no evidence that any apostle ever evangelized there. And Constantine's elevation to his city as the new Rome created animosity between it and actual apostolic bishops in Alexandria, Antioch, and eventually Rome. On the plus side, the western half of the empire's deprivation of political authority meant that the Pope was freed from the shackles of political ambition and pressure from the emperor, something which could not at all be said about the Bishop of Constantinople. So Western theology largely stayed the same, protected by Rome, whereas Eastern Christian theology turned into bloody, sometimes literally bloody, conflicts between rival cities of Alexandria, Antioch, and now Constantinople, all who had the emperor's favor to worry about now. The years 300 to 450 can be characterized as a time of structured ecclesial development, meaning Christianity morphed from a fairly fluid network of local churches to more structured dioceses centered on major cities that powerful bishops controlled. The bishops who supervised other bishops in their region were called patriarchs, and by the 5th century, Alexandria, Antioch, Rome, and Jerusalem each had a patriarch. It's at this point we see patriarchs gain administrative authority over other Christian communities. Rome's patriarch, the Pope, was responsible for central and southern Italy, as well as parts of France and Spain. He had no formal power over anywhere else, really. Eventually, Constantinople had one as well. So we've talked a bit about Rome's administrative development. What about Rome as a theological center? Up until the mid-4th century, Rome was recognized as a pillar of apostolic tradition that should be emulated, though the Pope's attempts to assert authority over cities had largely failed. This would start changing very slowly because of the constant disputes over doctrine that the Church faced for the rest of the first millennium. The first major one was called Arianism, which basically taught that Jesus was not fully God. The bishops from each major diocese attended a council in Nicaea in 325 to discuss this matter and eventually condemn this heresy. Despite the council's passage of a creed that declared Christ's divinity and opposed Arianism's ideas, there was a lot of debate after the council about interpretations of its teachings. Groundbreaking theologians who defended Christ's divinity, such as Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria, were sometimes deposed by their peers, and it's at that point we see people appealing to Rome for support. When rendering judgments, Rome cited its apostolic authority from Saints Peter and Paul, and the Pope's support of theologians like Athanasius usually won out in the end. In fact, during the mid-4th century, it was agreed that bishops like Athanasius who were deposed could be reinstated pending a court hearing called by Rome. Now, it's important to note that the Pope was not responsible for reinstating bishops, rather he was responsible for convening the Court of Appeals. Still, this was a fairly unique function to his office. The East was reluctant to depend too much on the Pope, but as conflicts erupted between its powerful bishops, they gradually embraced this system. By the end of the 4th century, though most important decisions were still made by councils of bishops, the Pope began issuing personal judgments on important matters, since convening councils was often time-consuming and unwieldy. Remember this fact throughout this series, this will be a trend. Despite the Pope's newfound ability to convene Court of Appeals, even he was not free from pressure from imperial authorities. Pope Liberius, who governed from 352 to 366, was forced to excommunicate Bishop Athanasius, and by pressure I mean threat of exile. As I mentioned before, the Council of Nicaea led to several disagreements between bishops. The councils of Constantinople and later Ephesus attempted to address these, but were still not enough. By the Second Council of Ephesus in 449, which is not recognized as an official council today, ended with an Alexandrian bishop letting a mob of soldiers and rampaging monks storm the vicinity, forcing the Patriarch of Constantinople to step down. You can learn more about this in my Ecumenical Councils series. Eventually, the Council of Chalcedon in 451 ironed out a significant number of these disputes, settling that Jesus was both fully human and fully divine, and explaining how this was in far more detail than any church council had done before. Interestingly enough, it was Pope Leo whose writings were accepted by all bishops as the church's official position. In fact, during the reading of his document, attendees shouted joyfully, "Peter has spoken through Leo." By the 5th century, many Christian communities began viewing the papacy as the gold standard of tradition, meaning other Christian communities, especially in the West, would measure themselves in comparison to Rome. Basically, if your local community agreed with Roman teaching, you were probably a good, solid Christian community. If not, there was probably a problem, and the problem was with you, not Rome. Though the Council of Chalcedon was a significant bolster of Rome's credibility among the other dioceses, the Pope still felt blowbacks against his authority. One of the decrees of Chalcedon, which was abhorred by and arguably never received by any of the other patriarchs, was Canon number 28. That is, that Constantinople is the bishop of the new Rome and should thus be second in rank among all the patriarchs. Pope Leo protested the inclusion of this canon, and the Alexandrians in particular were infuriated by it. But for the sake of closing the council, the decree was passed nonetheless. Little did Rome know that caving into this demand would spell a lot of trouble not so far down the road. Just a few years after the council, a movement called Monophysitism began. This movement rejected the Council of Chalcedon's decision that Jesus is both fully human and fully divine. The Monophysite position came from the arguably more conservative Christians who claimed that Chalcedon's declaration that Jesus has two natures was too innovative of an idea. Monophysitism spread like wildfire around the empire, mostly in the East, which posed a problem. The growing Islamic Empire was at the Eastern Roman Empire's doorstep, and now was not the time for division. So the emperor came up with a clever scheme. What if he could get Rome to condemn the writings of authors who heavily influenced Chalcedon, but without condemning the council itself? Perhaps that would make critics of Chalcedon happy while not upsetting the council's supporters. At the time, for the most part, the emperor let the western half of the empire do its own thing. That said, papal elections needed to be confirmed by the emperor, and the emperor still saw himself as administratively superior to the pope. So Pope Vigilius, who was hand-picked by the Emperor Justinian, was asked to condemn 3 pro-Chalcedonian writings that had heavily influenced the council. Initially, Vigilius said yes. He was installed by the emperor as a puppet, after all. But, much to the emperor's surprise, Vigilius actually retracted his condemnation. The emperor was furious, and he called the Second Council of Constantinople in 553, which did not involve Rome, though it is considered by the Catholic Church as legitimate. A large chunk of the time at the council was spent arguing against papal supremacy over other patriarchs. Worse yet, Pope Vigilius was brought to Constantinople for imprisonment. After much duress, the captive Holy Father reissued his condemnation of the three writings. This is known by theologians today as the Three Chapters controversy, since the writings that were condemned were 3 chapters of different books. Outrage spread across the Western Empire. Pope Vigilius was labeled a traitor for caving in to the emperor. The North Africans excommunicated the Pope. The cities of Milan and Aquila also broke communion with Rome, a separation which lasted for 150 years. In hindsight, we can see that the Pope's decision was undoubtedly due to his mistreatment by the emperor, but at the time, this whole situation was a massive blow to papal authority. We've been talking a lot about the Eastern Emperor. You might wonder where the Patriarch of Constantinople was at the time. Well, here we see the beginning of a trend that would tempt the West in the Middle Ages and arguably led to the demise of Eastern Christianity's global authority: the meshing of church and state. You see, despite all the intentions of spiritual forces governing worldly ones, at the end of the day, he who controls the riches and armies is really in charge. Thus, quite rapidly in Constantinople, the emperor deprived the patriarch of all his administrative roles. The patriarch effectively became a sacrament dispenser, a ceremonial high priest of sorts. It was the emperor, not the patriarch, who saw his mission to maintain order in the church. And this would be a temptation that we'd see the Western Church fight off until the First Vatican Council in the 1800s. Anyways, another blow to papal authority came in the 600s. Monophysitism took a backseat for a new approach. What if Christ was human and divine, but his every action was controlled by a singular divine will? This heresy was called monothelitism. Once again, for the sake of maintaining order, the Eastern Emperor wanted to accept this as a valid position, and when he asked the Pope to agree with this, well, he did. This time there were no threats, no prisons, no councils, just sheer incompetence. To the Emperor's luck, Pope Honorius didn't know what on earth he was talking about. He was not a theologian by any measure and never claimed to be one. In a letter, he stated that monothelitism was an acceptable position to hold. Upon Honorius' death, the Western bishops rushed into damage control mode, going as far as to condemn the Pope's letter at the Third Council of Constantinople. Most historians and theologians agree that this is an excellent example of material heresy, meaning the Pope did not mean to contradict church teaching, rather he just didn't really know what he was talking about. Still, the Third Council of Constantinople set an important precedent that yes, a council of bishops can determine that a pope has fallen into heresy. As the Eastern Roman Empire, by now called the Byzantine Empire, struggled against the Muslim invasions, Rome began seeing a bolster in political power, which was flexed during the controversy of iconoclasm. During the 8th century, some Eastern rulers considered the veneration of icons and religious imagery to be idolatrous, as they claimed people were worshipping the images of God rather than God himself. So they banned all art that depicted Jesus, which is a tragedy considering how much ancient artwork was destroyed because of this. To make matters worse, it seemed like each successive emperor reversed the prior one's position on the issue, leading to 100 years of instability on the issue of icons. Eventually, the East tried holding councils to ban icons once and for all, but they were never accepted as valid by the public because Rome was not in attendance. One patriarch stated, "Without the Romans, no dogma can receive definitive approbation, for they preside over the episcopal office, and they have received this dignity from the 2 leading apostles." Finally, a council was called in Nicaea to settle this issue once and for all. While Rome wasn't too involved in this council, it did send representatives to state that the venerations of icons is indeed okay, and this was the winning position. The next event I will mention really cemented Rome as a political and theological powerhouse. In the year 800 AD, Pope Leo III crowned a very important emperor of the Western Roman Empire. You may know him as Charlemagne. Charlemagne, being a brilliant tactician, made an agreement. So long as the papacy approves his reign, he would ensure the protection of the papacy and the spread of Christianity across his empire. Charlemagne managed to unite Western Europe, which had been fractured by centuries of wars and invasions. Eastern Europe, on the other hand, was torn apart by invasions and internal instability. Speaking of which, there was a decades-long battle for the seat of Patriarch of Constantinople in the mid to late 9th century. The nature of this conflict is a bit complex, and you can learn about it in my video on the Fourth Council of Constantinople, but it is significant because at long last the Eastern bishops turned to the Pope for his opinion in deciding who became their patriarch. Things had finally come full circle as the Patriarch of Constantinople was decided by the Pope. We've covered quite a few centuries in this episode. Now, as we enter the Middle Ages, we see a weakened Eastern Church and a politically emboldened Western Church. As we saw with the Eastern bishops, this political success drew all sorts of temptations. But while the Byzantine bishops were ultimately dominated by their political rulers, Rome would learn from their counterparts' failures and take measures to protect the independence of the papacy. That is what we'll talk about next week. Until then, have a great day. God bless you.